Hi, friends, and welcome back to Aftermath. So, something happened about a week ago or so that sparked a lot of conversation online, especially on Catholic Twitter. And I gotta be honest, I don't really spend that much time on Catholic Twitter or on Twitter in general because it kind of scares me. Twitter can really turn almost anything into chaos in about 5 minutes, so I kind of stay away. But the situation that unfolded actually raised a much bigger question that I think is worth talking about. So I'm going to give you the cliff notes here. So, from what I understand, feel free to correct me in the comments, but there was a Catholic conference who had invited a speaker. He's on YouTube and Instagram, a Catholic speaker. But later on, some of the sponsors, primarily female sponsors, or I guess only female sponsors, saw that this gentleman who was invited to the event had given an interview about 2 years ago where he had talked about feminism and patriarchy and submission within marriage from a Catholic man's perspective. And some of the sponsors apparently had a problem with what he said and threatened to pull their funding and pull their sponsorship if he remained a speaker. Eventually, the conference organizer, the gentleman in charge of it, made the decision to uninvite this speaker. Now, I'm not really interested in getting into like the internet drama aspect of it. I don't think it's very productive. And there's enough out there if you want to go look it up. But watching the reaction unfold online made something very, very clear. The moment the word feminism enters the conversation among Catholics, the discussion explodes. So you have these two sets of camps. Some Catholics will immediately say that feminism has absolutely no place in the church and is fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. And then others will say that feminism simply means advocating for the dignity of women, and therefore Catholics should embrace it. But the reality is, and I'm giving my 2 cents that nobody asked for, in my opinion, the reality is that those two groups are often talking about completely different things when they say the word feminism. If someone defines feminism simply as believing that women have dignity and should not be mistreated, then of course Catholics agree with that. The church has always taught that men and women are equal in dignity. That teaching comes straight from scripture. In Genesis, we are told that both man and women were created in the image and likeness of God, and their dignity doesn't come from politics or social movement or cultural approval. Their dignity comes from God himself. Historically, Christianity elevated the dignity of women in ways that were actually radical for the ancient world. In many ancient cultures, women were treated as property. They had very little legal protection, and their value was often tied entirely to the men in their lives. Christianity challenged that by teaching that women possessed equal spiritual dignity before God. But when most people today talk about feminism, they're not simply talking about the dignity of women. They're talking about modern feminism, which has become something much more ideological. When people say feminism today, they're usually not talking about the basic dignity or respect for women. They're talking about a very specific worldview that has developed over the last 50 or 60 years. Modern feminism teaches several core ideas. It teaches that traditional family structures are oppressive to women. It teaches that motherhood is often a burden that limits a woman's freedom and potential. It teaches that male leadership within the family is inherently unjust and part of something called the patriarchy. It also promotes a very specific view of the body and sexuality. Modern feminism generally supports abortion as a fundamental right, supports sexual autonomy detached from marriage and family, and often treats the differences between men and women as something that should be minimized or erased. When you line those ideas up next to Catholic teaching, the conflict becomes very obvious. The Catholic Church teaches that motherhood is not a burden, but a sacred vocation. Modern feminism often frames motherhood as something that women need liberation from. The Catholic Church teaches that children are a gift and that human life begins at conception. Modern feminism has largely tied itself to the defense of abortion as a central pillar of women's freedom. The Catholic Church teaches that men and women are different in meaningful ways and that those differences are part of God's design. But modern feminism often insists that those differences are social constructs that should just be dismantled. The Catholic Church teaches that marriage is a covenant ordered toward love, family, and the raising of children. Modern feminism frequently treats marriage as optional or even suspect because it introduces structure and responsibility into relationships. And when you put those things side by side, it becomes difficult to argue that modern feminism and Catholic teachings are simply two different ways of saying the same thing. They are built on two completely different visions of the human person. Modern feminism tends to define freedom as independence from obligation, independence from traditional roles, and autonomy over one's body and life. Christianity defines freedom very differently. Freedom is not the absence of responsibility. Freedom is the ability to give yourself in love. Modern feminism tends to frame history as a long story of male oppression and female victimhood. It often presents men and women as competing groups locked in a power struggle. Traditional structures like marriage and motherhood and family life are frequently portrayed as systems that hold women back rather than vocations that can give life meaning and stability. In many modern feminist frameworks, independence and autonomy are treated as the highest goods. Women are encouraged to pursue freedom primarily through career success or personal autonomy and detachment from traditional roles like marriage and motherhood. But the Catholic Church doesn't see the relationship between men and women as competition for power. It sees it as a partnership that's ordered toward love, family, and the flourishing of human life. This is where I think the conversation about patriarchy and submission often becomes extremely confused. When modern culture hears the word patriarchy, it usually imagines a system where men dominate women, where they silence them, control them, and treat them as inferior. And if that were what Christianity taught, then of course Catholics would reject it. But that's not what the church means when it talks about order within the family. The Catholic understanding of the family includes the idea that the husband carries a particular responsibility for leadership within the household. But leadership in the Christian sense is not about control. It's about responsibility, sacrifice, and service. In the New Testament, St. Paul describes marriage by comparing it to the relationship between Christ and the church. And he says that husbands should love their wives as Christ loves the church. And how did Christ love the church? He laid down his life for her. So the leadership that the church speaks about is not the leadership of a tyrant. It's the leadership of someone who's called to serve and protect and sacrifice for his family. A Christian husband is called to put the good of his wife and children before himself. In that same passage, St. Paul also talks about wives being subject to their husbands, which is the word often translated as submission. But that concept is almost always misunderstood. Again, in modern discussions, the line immediately before that passage says something incredibly important because it says, "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." The Christian vision of marriage is built on mutual self-gift. Both husband and wife are called to give themselves to one another fully. Both are called to sacrifice for one another. Both are called to serve one another in love. Submission in this context does not mean inferiority. It means trusting the order that God established within the family and participating in a relationship built on love rather than competition. Modern feminism struggles with this idea because it tends to interpret authority itself as oppression. In that framework, any structure where one person carries leadership responsibility is viewed as unjust. The Catholic teaching sees authority very differently. Proper authority exists to serve and protect the people entrusted to it. Another major reason this conversation becomes very heated very quickly is because modern feminism often frames history as a story of something called the patriarchy, where men collectively oppressed women for thousands of years. But that explanation of history is much more simplistic than people realize. For most of human history, both men and women lived extremely difficult lives. Men were expected to fight wars, perform dangerous labor, and carry the burden of providing for their families under very harsh conditions. Women carried and raised children in a world without modern medicine, where childbirth itself was often life-threatening. Society was not organized primarily around male privilege. It was organized around survival. Families were structured in ways that allowed them to survive economically, socially, and physically. Men generally carried the responsibility of protection and provision, and women carried the responsibility of nurturing life and raising the next generation. Those roles didn't exist because men hated women. They existed because human societies had to function in ways that allowed families to survive. The modern narrative that history was simply men oppressing women ignores how interdependent men and women actually were. When you look specifically at Christian civilization, the church consistently taught that men had serious moral obligations toward women. Husbands were not free to abandon their wives. Marriage was not meant to be temporary, and women were not disposable. Christianity introduced the idea that marriage was a lifelong covenant, and that placed enormous responsibility on men to remain faithful and sacrificial toward their wives. One of the most profound reflections on the dignity of women in the modern church came from Pope St. John Paul II. He wrote extensively about the relationship between men and women in his teachings known as Theology of the Body, which I really recommend that everybody reads. Pope St. John Paul II emphasized something that was very important, which is the difference between men and women is not a problem to solve. It's a gift. Men and women reveal something about God through their relationship with one another. Their ability to give themselves in love reflects the love, self giving love of God Himself. He also wrote that women often possess a very unique sensitivity to the dignity of the human person. So, in other words, women frequently have a special capacity to recognize and protect the value of human life and relationships. JP2 didn't see femininity as something that was secondary or inferior. He saw it as something that was profoundly important to the whole human story. But he also warned against ideologies that attempted to erase the differences between men and women or turn the relationship into a struggle for power. Because when men and women begin to see each other primarily as competitors, the family itself begins to fracture. When you look for the ultimate example of womanhood, women shouldn't look to political movements. They should look to the Virgin Mary. Mary is the greatest woman who ever lived. She holds the highest place among all human beings in the history of salvation. And what made Mary great wasn't her rejecting femininity or her vocation. It was her willingness to say yes to God's plan. Mary's greatness came from humility, courage, faith, and her openness to life. In many ways, the deeper conflict between modern feminism and Catholic teaching comes down to two completely different definitions of freedom. Modern feminism often defines freedom as independence, autonomy, and the ability to define your life without constraint. Christianity defines freedom very differently. In the Christian vision, freedom is the ability to give yourself in love. It's the freedom to sacrifice for others, to build families, and to participate in God's creative work through relationships and the gift of life. The internet drama that sparked this conversation will probably fade quickly because social media cycles move pretty quickly. But the deeper conversation about men, women, family, and the meaning of human relationships isn't going away. The Catholic Church will always defend the dignity of women, but it will also continue to challenge cultural movements that frame men and women as enemies and dismiss the value of life or redefine the meaning of love, authority, and freedom. And maybe the real challenge for Catholics today isn't trying to make the church fit into modern ideological movements. Maybe the real challenge is allowing the church's vision of the human person to challenge those movements instead. That is all I have for today. I will see you guys next time.